Yes, I'm going to make you happy, baby. I'm going to make you happy, oh, baby. I'm going to make you happy, me.
Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishineff, and we're reading Chapter 3. Well, we're starting Chapter 3 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, entitled Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. Remember, if you enjoy the episode, you know what to do. Hit that like and subscribe button, and hit that notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. Chapter 3. Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. In 1676, 70 years after Virginia was founded, 100 years before it supplied leadership for the American Revolution, that colony faced a rebellion of white frontiersmen joined by slaves and servants, a rebellion so threatening that the governor had to flee the burning capital of Jamestown, and England decided to send 1,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, hoping to maintain order among 40,000 colonists. This was Bacon's rebellion. After the uprising was suppressed, its leader, Nathaniel Bacon, dead, and his associates hanged, Bacon was described in a Royal Commission report. He was said to be about 4 or 5 and 30 years of age, indifferent, tall but slender, black-haired, and of an ominous, pensive, melancholy aspect of a pestilent and prevalent logical discourse tending to atheism. He seduced the vulgar and most ignorant people to believe, 2/3 of each county being of that sort, so that their whole hearts and hopes were set now upon Bacon. Next he charges the governor as negligent and wicked, treacherous and incapable, the laws and taxes as unjust and oppressive, and cries up absolute necessity of redress. Thus Bacon encouraged the tumult, and as the unquiet crowd follow and adhere to him, he listeth them as they come in upon a large paper, writing their name circular-wise, that their ringleaders might not be found out. Having cornered them into this circle, given them brandy to wind up the charm, and enjoined them by an oath to stick fast together and to him. And the oath being administered, he went and infected New Kent County ripe for rebellion. It's a mouthful. Bacon's rebellion began with conflict over how to deal with the Indians who were close by on the western frontier, constantly threatening. Whites who had been ignored when huge land grants around Jamestown were given away had gone west to find land, and there they encountered Indians. Were those frontier Virginians resentful that the politicos and landed aristocrats who controlled the colony's government in Jamestown first pushed them westward into Indian territory and then seemed indecisive in fighting the Indians? That might explain the character of their rebellion, not easily classifiable, as either anti-aristocrat or anti-Indian, because it was both. After the governor, William Berkeley, and his Jamestown crowd, were they more conciliatory to the Indians. They wooed certain of them as spies and allies. Now that they had monopolized the land in the east, could use frontier whites as a buffer and needed peace. The desperation of the government in suppressing the rebellion seemed to have a double motive, developing an Indian policy which would divide Indians in order to control them. In New England at this very time, Massasoit's son Metacom was threatening to unite Indian tribes and had done frightening damage to Puritan settlements in King Philip's War, and teaching the poor whites of Virginia that rebellion did not pay, by a show of superior force by calling for troops from England itself, by mass hanging. Violence had escalated on the frontier before the rebellion. Some Dogue Indians took a few hogs to redress a debt, and whites retrieving the hogs murdered 2 Indians. The Dogues then sent out a war party to kill a white herdsman, after which a white militia company killed 24 Indians. This led to a series of Indian raids, with the Indians, outnumbered, turning to guerrilla warfare. The House of Burgesses in Jamestown declared war on the Indians, but proposed to exempt those Indians who cooperated. This seemed to anger the frontiers people who wanted total war, but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war. Times were hard in 1676. There were genuine distress, genuine poverty. All contemporary sources speak of the great mass of people as living in severe economic straits, writes Wilcom Washburn, who, using British colonial records, has done an exhaustive study of Bacon's rebellion. It was a dry summer, ruining the corn crop, which was needed for food, and the tobacco crop, which was needed for export. Governor Berkeley, in his 70s, tired of holding office, wrote wearily about his situation. How miserable that man is that governs a people where 6 parts of 7, at least, are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. His phrase, 6 parts of 7, suggests the existence of an upper class not so impoverished. In fact, there was such a class already developed in Virginia. Bacon himself came from this class, had a good bit of land, and was probably more enthusiastic about killing Indians than about redressing the grievances of the poor. But he became a symbol of mass resentment against the Virginia establishment, and was elected in the spring of 1676 to the House of Burgesses. When he insisted on organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians outside official control, Berkeley proclaimed him a rebel and had him captured, whereupon 2,000 Virginians marched into Jamestown to support him. Berkeley let Bacon go in return for an apology, but Bacon went off, gathered his militia, and began raiding the Indians. Bacon's Declaration of the People of July 1676 shows a mixture of populist resentment against the rich and frontier hatred of the Indians. It indicted the Berkeley administration for unjust taxes, for putting favorites in high positions, for monopolizing the beaver trade, and for not protecting the western farmers from the Indians. Then Bacon went out to attack the friendly Pamunkey Indians, killing 8, taking others prisoner, plundering their possessions. There is evidence that the rank and file of both Bacon's rebel army and Berkeley's official army were not as enthusiastic as their leaders. There were mass desertions on both sides, according to Washburn. In the fall, Bacon, aged 29, fell sick and died because of, as a contemporary put it, swarms of vermin that bred in his body. A minister, apparently not a sympathizer, wrote this epitaph: Bacon is dead, I am sorry at my heart that lice and flux should take the hangman's part. The rebellion didn't last long after that. A ship armed with 30 guns cruising the York River became the base for securing order, and its captain, Thomas Grantham, used force and deception to disarm the last rebel forces. Coming upon the chief garrison of the rebellion, he found 400 armed Englishmen and Negroes, a mixture of free men, servants, and slaves. He promised to pardon everyone, to give freedom to slaves and servants, whereupon they surrendered their arms and dispersed, except for 80 Negroes and 20 English who insisted on keeping their arms. Grantham promised to take them to a garrison down the river, but when they got into the boat, guess what happened? He trained his big guns on them, disarmed them, and eventually delivered the slaves and servants to their masters. The remaining garrisons were overcome one by one. 23 rebel leaders were hanged. It was a complex chain of oppression in Virginia. The Indians were plundered by white frontiersmen who were taxed and controlled by the Jamestown elite. And the whole colony was being exploited by England, which bought the colonists tobacco at prices it dictated and made 100,000 pounds a year for the king. Berkeley himself, returning to England years earlier to protest the English Navigation Acts, which gave England merchants a monopoly of the colonial trade, had said, "We cannot but resent that 40,000 people should be impoverished to enrich little more than 40 merchants, who, being the only buyers of our tobacco, give us what they please for it, and after it is here, sell it how they please, and indeed have 40,000 servants in us at cheaper rates than any other men have slaves." So you'll see, as we go through this book, right there, that oligarchy that we have now, it's an ongoing theme. We inherited it from the English. We don't know any different. It's what we've always had. From the testimony of the governor himself, the rebellion against him had the overwhelming support of the Virginia population. I shouldn't say it's what we always had, because when it was England we had a king, that was technically monarchy, right? Not oligarchy. But the king was making decisions for the rich nobles under him, and so monarchy is not that different from oligarchy. From the testimony of the governor himself, the rebellion against him had the overwhelming support of the Virginia population. A member of his council reported that the defection was almost general, and laid it to the lewd dispositions of some persons of desperate fortunes, who had the vain hopes of taking the country wholly out of his majesty's hands into their own. Another member of the governor's council, Richard Lee, noted that Bacon's rebellion had started over Indian policy, but the zealous inclination of the multitude to support Bacon was due, he said, to hopes of leveling. And they're not talking about video games. Leveling meant equalizing the wealth, but you probably guessed that. Leveling was to be behind countless actions of poor whites against the rich in all the English colonies in the century and a half before the revolution. The servants who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserably poor whites who came to the North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and 1600s, the enclosing of land for the production of wool, life's not as bright as it looks, I swear. The enclosing of land for the production of wool filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish them, imprison them in workhouses, or exile them. The Elizabethan definition of rogues and vagabonds included all persons calling themselves scholars going about begging, all seafaring men pretending losses of their ships or goods on the sea going about the country begging, all idle persons going about in any country either begging or using any subtle craft or unlawful games, common players of interludes and minstrels wandering abroad, all wandering persons, and common laborers being persons able in body, using loitering, and refusing to work for such reasonable wages as is taxed or commonly given. Such persons found begging can be stripped to the waist and whipped bloody, could be sent out of the city, sent to workhouses, or transported out of the country. In the 1600s and 1700s, by forced exile, by lures, promises, and lies, by kidnapping, by their urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country, poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit for merchants, traders, ship captains, and eventually their masters in America. Abbott Smith, in his study of indentured servitude, colonists in bondage, writes, "From the complex pattern of forces producing emigration to the American colonies, one stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them." Now, I don't know if you've ever listened to Yanis Varoufakis talk about this time when they got rid of their feudal system, and they decided they could make profits selling wool, and all of a sudden the first labor force was created. And so they kicked people out, and the people had to go around looking for work. It's very interesting. After signing the indenture, in which the immigrants agreed to pay their cost of passage by working for a master for 5 or 7 years, they were often imprisoned until the ship sailed to make sure they did not run away. And why would you sign a deal that you need to make and then run away? And yet, if they were imprisoned, people must have been running away. They didn't just come up with that, right? In the year 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses, born that year as the first representative assembly in America, it was also the year of the first importation of black slaves, 1619. Provided for the recording and enforcing of contracts between servants and masters. As in any contract between unequal powers, the parties appeared on paper as equals, but enforcement was far easier for master than for servant. The voyage to America lasted 8, 10, or 12 weeks, and the servants were packed into ships with the same fanatic concern for profits that marked the slave ships. If the weather was bad and the trip took too long, they ran out of food. The sloop Seaflower, leaving Belfast in 1741, was at sea 16 weeks, and when it arrived in Boston, 46 of its 106 passengers were dead of starvation, 6 of them eaten by the survivors. And we talk about the Donner Party. On another trip, 32 children died of hunger and disease and were thrown into the ocean. Gottlieb Mittelberger, a musician traveling from Germany to America around 1750, wrote about his voyage. During the journey, the ship is full of pitiful signs of distress, smells, fumes, horrors, vomiting, various kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headaches, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and similar afflictions, all of them caused by the age and the high salted state of the food, especially of the meat, as well as by the very bad and filthy water. Add to all that the shortage of food, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, fear, misery, vexation, and lamentation, as well as other troubles. On board our ship on a day on which we had a great storm, a woman about to give birth and unable to deliver under the circumstances was pushed through one of the portholes into the sea. Oh my God. She fit through a porthole? Sorry. Bad. Indentured servants were bought and sold like slaves. An announcement in the Virginia Gazette, March 28, 1771, read, "Just arrived at Leedstown, the ship Justitia, with about 100 healthy servants, men, women, and boys. The sale will commence on Tuesday, the 2nd of April." Can you imagine being sold to somebody? I can't even imagine. Against the rosy accounts of better living standards in the Americas, one must place many others like one immigrant's letter from America. Whoever is well off in Europe better remain there. Here is misery and distress, same as everywhere, and for certain persons and conditions incomparably more than in Europe. Beatings and whippings were common. Servant women were raped. One observer testified, "I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head till the blood has followed. Although I'm sure that must be flowed. It says followed. Well, maybe it means followed. For a fault that is not worthy the speaking of. The Maryland court records showed many servant suicides. In 1671, Governor Berkeley of Virginia reported that in previous years, 4 of 5 servants died of disease after their arrival. Many were poor children gathered up by the hundreds on the streets of English cities and sent to Virginia to work. The master tried to control completely the sexual lives of the servants. It was in his economic interest to keep women servants from marrying or from having sexual relations because childbearing would interfere with work. Benjamin Franklin, writing as Poor Richard in 1736, gave advice to his readers, "Let thy maidservant be faithful, strong, and homely." Servants could not marry without permission, could be separated from their families, could be whipped for various offenses. Pennsylvania law in the 17th century said that marriage of servants without the consent of the masters shall be proceeded against as for adultery or fornication, and children to be reputed as bastards. Wow. Although colonial laws existed to stop excesses against servants, they were not very well enforced. We learn from Richard Morris's comprehensive study of early court records in Government and Labor in early America. Servants did not participate in juries, masters did. And being propertyless, servants did not vote. In 1666, a New England court accused a couple of the death of a servant after the mistress had cut off the servant's toes. The jury voted acquittal. In Virginia, in the 1660s, a master was convicted of raping 2 women servants. He also was known to beat his own wife and children. He had whipped and chained another servant until he died. The master was berated by the court, but specifically cleared on the rape charge despite overwhelming evidence. Sometimes servants organized rebellions, but one did not find on the mainland the kind of large-scale conspiracies of servants that existed, for instance, on Barbados in the West Indies. Abbott Smith suggests this was because there was more chance of success on a small island. However, in York County, Virginia in 1661, a servant named Isaac Friend proposed to another after much dissatisfaction with the food that they, and this is a quotation, get a matter of 40 of them together and get guns, and he would be the first and lead them and cry as they went along, who would be for liberty and free from bondage, and that there would be enough come to them, and they would go through the country and kill those that made any opposition, and that they would either be free or die for it. End quotation. The scheme was never carried out, but 2 years later in Gloucester County, servants again planned a general uprising. One of them gave the plot away, and 4 were executed. The informer was given his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco. Despite the rarity of servants' rebellions, the threat was always there, and masters were fearful. Finding their situation intolerable and rebellion impractical in an increasingly organized society, servants reacted in individual ways. The files of the county courts in New England showed that one servant struck at his master with a pitchfork. An apprentice servant was accused of laying violent hands upon his master and throwing him down twice and fetching blood of him, threatening to break his neck, running at his face with a chair. Spelling on some of these old things is really bizarre. It's hard to read. Chair, C-H-A-Y-R-E. One maidservant was brought into court for being bad, unruly, sullen, careless, destructive, and disobedient. After the participation of servants in Bacon's rebellion, the Virginia legislature passed laws to punish servants who rebelled. How dare you want your freedom? The preamble to the act said, whereas many evil-disposed servants in these late times of horrid rebellion, taking advantage of the looseness and liberty of the time, did depart from their service and followed the rebels in rebellion, wholly neglecting their masters' employment, whereby the said masters have suffered great damage and injury. It must have been hard for them. I'm so sorry for making fun. 2 companies of English soldiers remained in Virginia to guard against future trouble, and their presence was defended in a report to the Lords of Trade and Plantation, saying, Virginia is at present poor and more populous than ever. There is a great apprehension of a rising among the servants, owing to their great necessities and want of clothes. They may plunder the storehouses and ships. Escape was easier than rebellion. Numerous instances of mass desertions by white servants took place in the southern colonies, reports Richard Morris, on the basis of an inspection of colonial newspapers in the 1700s. The atmosphere of 17th century Virginia, he says, was charged with plots and rumors of combinations of servants to run away. The Maryland court records show in the 1650s a conspiracy of a dozen servants to seize a boat and to resist with arms if intercepted. They were captured and whipped. And I'd like to thank you for joining me. Tune in for the next episode, and we'll see you then. Hit that like and subscribe button.